I'm just going to run through, in particular, the impacts on emissions in 2020 and in more recent years. My colleague Paul Duffy will present later on the longer term trends. So first of all, just to say a little bit about our EPA climate science activities. So this is emission statistics team has produced this report today, and we also have a presentation from Ria Martin from the emissions trading and registry team. But the EPA does have a very broad remit on climate, spanning regulation, monitoring and reporting, research, engagement, and also Secretariat for the Climate Council. So there's a huge remit here, and also the inventory itself, the data we produce is not produced in-house in the EPA alone. We do collect a lot of data from other agencies and departments, and we rely heavily on them to produce the inventory, which is a really huge accumulation of multiple data sources from across the public sector in particular. Our role is both to produce greenhouse gas and air pollutant inventories and projections for our international reporting commitments, but also to provide the evidence base for national climate policy. So we're concerned with our with supporting the departments and agencies as they aim to implement their climate action plans and to tackle the carbon budget. And this report today is really more about the supporting the evidence, the national evidence base, in terms of inventory reporting. The timeline for our publications for 2020, we have produced already an indicator report back in January with the SCI, which was aimed at really just giving a first picture of what the impact of COVID on 2020 had been. Then in June, we produced the annual greenhouse gas projections report, which again is aimed at facilitating national policy rather than being a publication for European compliance. And that report was updated the initial estimates from the January report, and today now we have the first sight of inventory numbers. So the data in what we have today uses annual numbers from the final energy balance and annual numbers from other data sources such as agriculture, and that wouldn't have been available for the indicators earlier on in the year. So that's why we are seeing slightly different numbers coming out of what we have today than what we would have seen previously. The final version of the national inventory is submitted to the United Nations next April, and that will be a full detailed national inventory report, which runs to between 500 and 600 pages, plus several hundred more pages of tables that are stored electronically. So that's the kind of cycle. And as I say, we do support national policy in this, and we will be looking to see what we can do in the future with the carbon budgets and the climate action plan coming out again to see how we can best support the policymakers in their task ahead. So just moving on then to talking about what we are seeing in the numbers, as Sharon had pointed out already, we saw a 3.6% reduction on 2019 levels in overall emissions in 2020, and this is a welcome reduction. Where that has come from is a combination of things. Unrelated to COVID, we have reductions in the electricity generation sector. So less peat, 51% less peat, and more wind electricity generation has resulted in a drop in electricity industry emissions, or energy industry emissions. And in transport sector, we have emissions down 15.7%, which is almost 2 million tonnes, and that's really related to COVID restrictions. On the other hand, also due to COVID, we've seen increases in the residential sector and in the agriculture emissions, which weren't particularly influenced by COVID, went upwards. So just to give you the numbers for that, and just where this ends up in terms of compliance with European regulations, the EU effort sharing decision has a limit for 2020. This was exceeded by 6.7 million tonnes, and 2020 was the last year of the effort sharing decision. So we have a compliance over the lifetime of the scheme as well as the individual years, and over the lifetime of the 2013 to 2020 effort sharing decision, we exceeded our annual limits by in total cumulatively by 12 million tonnes, and that's something that will need to be. Compliance will need to be met through other means such as purchasing credits or bilaterally purchasing annual emission allocations from other countries who have met their targets. So the energy industry sector, as I said, saw a 7.9% reduction. That's nearly 750,000 tonnes, and as I say, the peat is a big part of that, but renewables are also up to 42%, having been down at 37% in 2019. In the transport sector, the 15.7% reduction was driven by petrol and diesel, but more petrol, there was a bigger reduction in petrol than what we saw in diesel, and that's probably related also to the increase, or sorry, the increased proportion of freight transport in the emissions. So freight transport accounted for 38% of emissions in 2020, and didn't decrease by about 5%, didn't decrease by anything like the extent of the decreases in passenger transport. So that's really what's keeping the diesel reduction higher, and also in the diesel passenger cars also may have been used more as the lockdown measures exited. In terms of the residential sector, the emissions increased by 9%, which is about 0.6 million tonnes, and in that we saw that kerosene in particular was up 19%, and this is also driven in addition to the COVID factor, where people are working from home and need to use their heat. There was also the factor that there was very low fuel prices for oil, particularly in the first part of 2020. So that was also a factor, and we do see that historically, if fuel prices are low, more people buy the fuel, and that's, I suppose, 101 economics. In terms of agriculture emissions, we saw an increase of 1.4% in 2020, and that was driven by increased activity all across the board, really, in agriculture. I mentioned the 3.2% increase in dairy cows because that's one of the biggest contributors, but we also saw increases in all the other metrics as well. So the milk production, of course, was up 3.8% as well. So really, the message has been one of mixed impacts from COVID. So obviously transport's the big headline one in terms of a really huge decrease, which we haven't seen on that scale before. But obviously the knock-on effect of our homes not being particularly efficient and being fueled by fossil fuels has meant that there was an increase in emissions there once people weren't moving around. Just to put the reduction into perspective, it was the 3.6% reduction compares to a 4% reduction we saw in 2019, and in total terms, that's 2 million tonnes, which is a welcome reduction, obviously, but doesn't really compare with the kind of reductions we saw coming out of the financial crisis, where we saw in 2009, for example, nearly a 6 million tonne decrease in emissions, and that's really because it wasn't across the board in terms of the impact of COVID. That the reductions were seen, whereas obviously with the financial crisis, it really was a economy-wide slump. And just to give you a graphic illustration of the effort sharing decision targets, so the burnt yellow, if you like, a colour at the bottom, those are the effort sharing emissions. The ETS emissions that Mary will be talking about later, that are sitting on top, they're not relevant for the target. But as you can see, for the first 3 years of the scheme, we actually had accumulated surpluses about somewhere in the region of 10 million tonnes. But once we got to 2016 and beyond, we started to exceed every year the targets, and cumulatively that led to a 12 million tonne shortfall over the lifetime of the scheme, which does mean that, as I say, that compliance needs to be put in place by other means. In terms of the sectoral share of emissions in 2020, well, the impact of transport and energy industries emissions going down really has been that the share of agriculture has gone up. So you can see that on the left, it's gone up from 35 to 37% of total greenhouse gas emissions, which are at 57.7 million tonnes now, just over 2 million tonnes less than last year, than 2019, I should say. The other movers in that residential sector obviously increased its proportion slightly, just up to 12% now as well. Energy went to 15 and transport went to 18, so they both went down. The other sectors, a relatively smaller contribution, but and haven't moved significantly in terms of share. So just looking a bit more closely at agriculture, both 2020 itself and the most recent years, it has been on a gradually increasing trajectory since 2010, really, and actually within that you can see some particularly notable rises. 2018 was the high point, and there was a reason for that, but due to the drought in that year, where lots of fertilizer and lime were spread to try and make something grow, essentially. But obviously the cows were fed high concentrates as well, because there was very little grass available. So it is a situation where that year was a bit of an outlier. But the trend from 2010 or from 2011, I should say, onwards, when is really an increase, and it's really driven by the dairy sector particularly. Overall emissions were up 16% since 2011 in the agriculture sector, and up about 11% on 1990. And Paul will talk more about the longer term trends later on. Methane emissions up about 18.5% since 1990. And just to move on a little bit to the drivers in the dairy sector. So we have seen a 46% increase in dairy cattle from the last 10 years, and about a 60% increase in milk output associated with that. You know, it's a combination of factors in terms of the methane emissions, because it's not just the increase in the number of animals, but also the increase in the methane emissions per dairy cow. And again, Paul will dig into that a bit more deeply later on. But yeah, the yield per cow in terms of milk production is about 40% up on 1990 levels at this stage, or nearly 10% up in the last 10 years. So moving on then to transport. Obviously this is the sector we saw the big drop in 2020, nearly 16%, as we said. I've got a graph that just shows you the fuel contribution to that. Emissions from transport have actually had somewhat stabilized in recent years. We'd seen increases from year to year coming out of the exit of the financial crisis for the first 3 or 4 years, and then since 2015, really it's been kind of up and down and fairly flat. And really what that appears to have happened is that the increases in biofuels have just about kept pace with increased transport demand. So it hasn't led to decreases. Obviously we're looking to see big decreases here as we go out to 2030, but to date really the impact of the biofuel has been about just about keeping pace with growth. So in terms of electric vehicles, there's still a relatively small number. So in 2020 there was about 26,000 electric vehicles in Ireland in terms of BEVs and FEVs. You know, which is a substantial number, but still about 3% of the policy target for in the climate action plan for 2030. And so really it's not having an impact on emissions savings just yet. Biofuels have saved about approximately 500,000 tonnes of CO2 emissions in 2020. So, and similar in the couple of years before that. So they are beginning to have an impact. Although, you know, and actually cumulatively since 2005, biofuels have saved 4.4 million tonnes, but that compares to total transport emissions in that time from fossil fuels of 183 million tonnes. So it's a welcome measure, but obviously needs to increase a lot to get us to the big reductions that are in the climate ambition, the national climate ambition. So just to look at what happened in the fuels in 2020 itself, and obviously what we know to date for 2021 as well. So the blue line here is 2019, the red line 2020, and you can see straight away where the lockdown started and then progressed to a much deeper lockdown. And really the demand or the sales of this data comes from the NORA levy data. The fuel sold didn't really recover in 2020 in terms of petrol, and even in 2021, it's still at the latest data I have here, which goes back from August, it still hasn't quite got up to the 2020 or sorry, the 2019 levels. Diesel is a little bit different. So diesel, in terms of where it's gone now, it has recovered to and this is even by July, August, it has recovered to the levels we would have seen in 2019. And even in 2020, although we did still see the deep shock there at the start of the year, it had recovered quite well, and it hadn't the drops compared to 2019 was less deep than it had been for petrol, for example, later on. So that explains the kind of 14% reduction versus 26% reduction overall. And just finally, a little bit on jet kerosene. I'm going to touch a little bit on international aviation because it is an interesting story. Now, just to be clear, international aviation, by which I mean flights into and out of Ireland, not flights around the world, isn't part of Ireland's inventory. The only part of aviation that's included in Ireland's inventory are flights between Irish airports, and this is an international convention that international aviation would be treated globally as a global problem, and doesn't get recorded as part of the total greenhouse gas emissions for individual countries. But having said that, obviously the emissions associated with international aviation do count for climate change. So it's interesting to look at what has happened, and you can really see a huge drop here. So jet kerosene in 2020 was 65% down in 2019. And the first 8 months of 2021 were still 44% down in 2019. So it is a very much depressed sector at the moment, obviously with the restrictions on travel, and that has had a knock-on effect in terms of emissions. So when we look at the emissions associated with the international aviation into and out of Ireland, you're talking about a reduction in return flight numbers of from 140,000 down to about 40,000. And a reduction in emissions of in the region of 2 million tons. So it's yes, it's a big saving for the planet, but not something that gets reflected in national inventories by convention. And also, you can see this, and I know Paul will talk about this later, but international aviation had been on a very sharply increasing trend prior to COVID. So there's a bigger part to that story, and it'd be interesting to see, obviously, where it goes next, whether that rebound will happen or whether it will be a different story post 2021. And moving on to energy industries, so they went down, as I say, 7.9%, and this has been a really positive story to date. So we've got a renewable share going up, we've got peat and coal going down, and that's led to big reductions in emissions, and particularly since 2016, we've been seeing a really positive downward trend. A lot of that is due to one-off trends, and we've mentioned this in that, positive as it is, but you can only shut down peat or coal once, so from here on, really, those peat and coal are quite a low level, and it will depend on renewable and the pace of renewable generation coming onto the grid, how quickly we can get our emissions down from this sector in the future, and obviously. There is also the fact that, as we come out of COVID and the prices of gas particularly high at the moment, and there is the potential for fuels like coal to be used more, and that may be something we see in the 2021 inventory. And the effect of that, of course, will be emissions going back up again, if that is the case. So just to look a little bit more at the electricity demand. As I say, the emissions from electricity have gone down 8%, but the demand itself didn't actually really go down. And you can see from this, the blue line there is the 2020, and the orange line is 2019. And whilst there were periods where we did see a drop in demand, particularly at the beginning of the lockdown, over the course of the year, demand was very similar between 2019 and 2020. So in actual fact, the reduction in emissions was driven by changes in fuel rather than a reduction in demand due to COVID, particularly. Looking at the intensity, I mean, we pointed out that this is the first time now we're below 300 grams CO2 per kilowatt hour intensity of electricity generation, and that's a very positive development. But as I did indicate, and there's always a but, what happens next is going to be the key thing. Now that we have managed to bring coal and peat to such low levels, can that be maintained, and can we implement the climate action plan measures around additional renewable generation quickly, so that we get to our 2030 targets. A little bit on the global demand, because it is something worth pointing out. The global drop in energy demand over the course of 2020 was very substantial, and if you can see, in this case, it was actually far greater of an impact globally than the financial crisis was. And actually, the big things that were comparable to that were world wars earlier on in the century. And the reason why it was so significant globally, but not as significant for Ireland, of course, is because 37% of our emissions are agriculture. We're not a particularly high energy industrial country where more of our economy is devoted to agriculture than industry. So you will see other countries that would have bigger drops because they're more industrial focused. But what we also see from the IEA data, and this is a more recent graph, is that there's two things of interest here. So they saw that's the big drop in 2020 and the fuel types that drove that drop. So we see coal going down, oil going down. Oil was the biggest part of the drop, and oil being fueling international aviation amongst lots of other things, transport in general. But if you see the rebound in 2021, you're seeing a bigger part of the rebound being driven by coal, and that's got to do with fuel prices, and particularly in Asia and the Far East, coal plants being built and coal plants operating. So globally, there's a big question mark over what the rebound will look like in 2021 in terms of global emissions, because there does seem to be a resurgence of coal, particularly in the Far East. Moving on to residential sector emissions, and this is where we saw the 9% increase due to, as we said, the lockdown measures particularly, and historic low oil prices. So I mean the two worked in combination to increase emissions, particularly when we saw that big increase in kerosene. Heating wasn't really a factor particularly. It was a very average year in terms of weather, so temperature, I should say, wasn't really a particular factor that we can see. So from the degree days data that we get from Met Éireann, it's not obvious that there was a particularly strong impact from the weather. So it really is a story of fuel prices and COVID in terms of the rise in 2020. What we do see a little bit from this graph, and maybe more clearly in the next one, is that we are seeing a flattening out in the number, in the amount of tons of CO2 per household. So we had been on a very decreasing trend, and Paul will go into the reasons why that occurred in the past. But from here, from 2014 on, 2014 was the low point in terms of tons of CO2 per household, and that's really been increasing gradually since then, or at least not decreasing. And you know, part of that is part of that is low fuel prices that we talked about, but it's a really big challenge for the future, because obviously we have huge targets in the Climate Action Plan from 2019, and more than likely in the next one as well, in relation to retrofitting and building heat pumps, and those will really be needed to get to the next stage, to start to see emissions per household continue to decline as they had done in the past for fuel switching reasons. But going forward, it is something that is needed to where we need, you know, action on very quickly. Just a quick talk then a little bit about the remaining sectors. So emissions from manufacturing and combustion decreased by 1.5%. Just a fairly small amount that we probably would have maybe expected a little bit more, but some industries were up and some industries were down, so it wasn't really across the board. And I know Maria will be able to talk a bit more about the industry side of things. On the industrial processes side, we saw a 7% reduction, and again, we will talk more about that, but the cement plants are a big part of that reduction. In terms of the waste sector, really the reductions we're seeing are kind of a continuation of a trend that's been there for a few years now, so it's more to do with less waste going to landfill and less landfills being open in general. F-gas emissions were down just over 14%, and that's driven by as I say, reduction in refrigeration and air conditioning emissions, but it's not to do with activity so much. This is to do with switching to F-gases that have a lower global warming potential, as we call it, i.e. a different impact on global warming. So if you can replace a gas that has a high global warming potential with a lower one, you get a reduction, sometimes a big reduction, because some of the global warming potentials of the gases used in say mobile air conditioning back in the 80s and 90s had global warming potentials in the thousands. So if you can get that down to something comparable to CO2, which is obviously one, you can make a big reduction in emissions without necessarily having an impact on activity. In commercial services sector and public services sector, we've seen, you know, relatively flat overall, so not much impact there, obvious there from COVID to date. We will get more information on 2020 business energy in the future with the business energy survey for 2020 when that comes out, but you know, relatively flat in terms of 2020 to date overall. Finally, I just wanted to really look a little bit about the national targets, because I know this is it's not inventories as such. This is related to the projections that we brought out in July, but just because I know people are wondering where are we with all this. So the 51% target from the Climate Act is 51% below the 2018 level by 2030. The projections we brought out in July indicated that based on implementing everything, a full implementation of the 2019 Climate Action Plan, and that would get us to about a 24% below the 2018 level reduction. So clearly you can see from that the next Climate Action Plan and the carbon budgeting process will have to indicate how we're going to make that to fill the remainder of that gap, and it's a huge increase, a huge step up. So the shaded area there is more than 100 million tons of the gap. So look, this is just to give you that bit of information. I know we've already published this before back in July, but it is something to be conscious of. These numbers today don't really change that picture. And we saw a 3.6% reduction, as I say, in 2020. The reductions needed annually out to 2030 are more of the order 7 million ton, 7% I should say per year, depending on how you frame the target, of course, and the carbon budgeting process will tell us that. So that's really it for the slides. Just to conclude again, there is a welcome overall reduction in emissions, and we need to point that out. Every time emissions go down, it's a good thing, but the majority was due to short-term decreases, which will likely be once off, hopefully. In many sectors, greenhouse gas emissions are still closely coupled to activity and output, and Sharon said this already. We need to break those links, so we need to be able to change. It's not just about stopping, it's about changing in order to be able to meet the Fit for 55 ambition and our own national ambition, of course. And then more urgently, I suppose we have to think about what's happening next as we get out of, how do we recover from COVID and get out of this situation. We need to avoid a growth in greenhouse gas emissions during the recovery, and everything we can do to do that is obviously very important in how we get to our 2030 targets. So that's it from me. I'm just going to point you in the direction of our website, where we have our latest data has been updated there this morning. If you want to get into it, it's probably just put in epa.ie/GHG and you'll see everything up there. So thanks very much for your time.